Welcome back to the Blackletter podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Blackletter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Blackletter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Blackletter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify black-letter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening.
Welcome back to another episode of the Blackletter podcast. I'm Tom Dunlap. With me, I have Mark Fava. And Mark is a former U.S. military pilot, retired as a captain, which is the equivalent in the Army to me as of colonel in 06, I believe, right? And
Correct.
Spent years in the reserves while also practicing aviation law, built his practice from the ground up in aviation law, and eventually found his way to the Boeing Corporation, where he works now as an ombudsman in-house for Boeing, which we talked about in the last episode. This episode, we're going to talk to Mark a little bit about his entrepreneurship and what he does working with veterans and how he helps people and advice he might have for people who are looking to follow his career path. So, Mark, I'm not going to set it up with too many questions. Tell us, I guess, I'll let you just freeform here and kind of give us your spiel here. What's going on with Mark and what do you do?
I was very fortunate, like you, Tom, in the military experience. I got to work for some great people very early on. There's obviously great leaders in the military, not so great, but I worked as an admiral's aide, and then as a lawyer, I worked as for a federal judge, and then in-house, I've worked for a couple of in-house counsels. So I was always trying to mine data from them about, okay, what are their best practices, what I
Right.
like, what I don't like, and
What did you like your admiral? Because I have to,
well, again, I was very fortunate to work for two great admirals and I'm writing a little bit about those lessons because some of the nuggets they planted in my head, this is, back 1990-ish.
So
I
were you
still
in
use today.
03 then, or?
Yeah. I was
Yep.
03. You know how that goes because you did
I
the
was
same in the
an
military.
aide de camp to a general, so I think
Yeah.
pretty much a 2-star, so pretty much the equivalent.
Yep.
And we're cut 2 years. So I feel like I really liked my general, but there were some generals that I came across in that job. But I was like,
Oh, yeah.
oh my God, I am glad I do not work for that guy. I'm not going to
There's
mention any names, but wow.
listen,
So
I know exactly that, Tom. The scariest day of my life working for him was when he told me he had orders to go from, I was in Brunswick, Maine, where the P3 community was centered, down to Norfolk. He was going to be the admiral to run the Norfolk base. He said he wanted me to come with him, and I was already planning to go to law school. So I had to go in the next day, tell him I didn't want to go with him, and tell him I wanted to go to law school. And I thought one of two things was going to happen. Either he was going to say okay, or he was going to fire me. Because back then, if you weren't a career person, and again, he looked at me and said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he goes, "Can I talk you out of it?" I said, "No, sir." And then he said to me words I never forget. He said, "What can I do to help you out?" So, I mean, exactly to your point, this was a
right,
jewel of a guy.
that's fantastic. And then he became is that NES Oceana that he became the commander of that base?
Yeah, actually, he was the whole NAS and all the ships. So he had the
Oh
entire
wow.
Norfolk Naval Base. He was just as a 2-star. He was there, and I inherited another admiral who, he told him, he said, this guy's good, a baby admiral, and he said, this guy's good. He'll teach you everything you need to know. I want him to stay on. So I was just very fortunate. So you pick up those little tidbits along the way,
Right.
and I did the same thing with the judge that I worked for, and then try and now pass those on to other people.
Great. Well, so tell me what you're passing on and tell me about your kind of mentorship program. You talked a little bit about that before, but now you said you'd like to mentor veterans who are or fellow lawyers. And I mean, just talk about that because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, no, listen, you're obviously, really good on LinkedIn too, but what an incredible platform. People reach out to you. I have law students reach out to me, and your general reaction when that first happens is, "I'm too busy. I just, I got so much else to do."
Right.
But what I find is if you agree to do it and to talk to them, it's like the most rewarding thing you've done all day. So, I just got off a call of a young law student, went to Chapel Hill, saw my name out there and pinged me. I have a guy that went to the Citadel that did the same thing, just left the Army as an Apache helicopter and a Citadel instructor to go to Alabama Law School. And the other thing is it doesn't have to be just lawyers, right? I've got a couple of young engineers. One I've been mentoring for a couple of years at the factory. and told her 3 years ago, when are you going to get your master's? And I'm happy to say she's 75% through with her master's, and
That's
so
great.
it's a lot of fun doing that. And I had people do that for me.
That's great. So, Mark, anything else you'd kind of like to tell us about your current activities and how you, I guess, how you interface? So I understand you mentor people who reach out to you on LinkedIn. Do you have a forward-looking? You have a website of your own that's separate from your job at Boeing. So tell us a little bit about that and what's that's all
Yeah, no, one of the nice things about COVID is there's plenty of free time, right? So
about. Mhm.
I did a little bit. I got back to watching TV, which was more for for the mental state, just to do something fun. But I also started writing. So I said, look, I got all this stuff I've been learning from other people. Let's just try and put it down. So I started a blog, theaviatorlawyer.com, and the first 15 series, Tom, are the stuff I learned from the admiral. And I'm going to go on to the stuff I learned from the judge, and then I hope to be around long enough to go on to the stuff I learned from the general counsel. Just neat
Gotcha.
stories, that talk about those lessons.
So if somebody wants to look for that, that's theaviatorlawyer.com. How's that blog been received so far, Mark? Have you had any feedback from people, or have you had anybody reach out to you as a result of the blog?
I have, I haven't been pushing it a lot because I wanted to get a lot of content up on it
Sure.
first and
Yep.
wanted to polish it and make sure, it had some stuff. So this could be the world debut. But I have had people, you track the Google results and who's hitting it, and it's amazing. It is going up and up, and people have commented, especially veterans, because we can all connect to those stories and those lessons that we then take on with our civilian careers.
That's fantastic. Great. Well, Mark, so what I'd like to do is in the next segment is talk to you about advice. So the thing, and maybe it's from your blog. Maybe you're going to tell me things you've already written about. But what one or two or three or four? I don't. There's no magic number. But what are the major pieces of advice that if we were watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, and I hung up on the podcast, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I can remember those three things or those two things. What are those pieces of advice? And I'll close this episode. And I'm going to welcome you back in just a minute. But if you have those things in your head, and if you want to, feel free to plagiarize from somebody else if you like their advice. But give us those three pieces of advice, and we'll be back. And thank you, audience, for listening to this episode of the Blackletter podcast. We'll be back with Mark Fava next week with his final kind of his advice for you and what you can do and use and take with you in the world as you move forward with your career, as you move forward with either being an aviation lawyer or working for a big company. I don't know. It'll be a surprise to us what Mark says. Download us wherever you get your podcasts. I said it last week: iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Android Play Store, all those great places. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
That's all for today's episode of Blackletter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Blackletter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.